A homeless man stopped JD Vance on the street, asking for just $1. What happened next left the entire crowd stunned. It was one of those afternoons in downtown Cincinnati. Clouds threatening rain but never delivering. The air was thick with the scent of damp pavement and fast food grease, a mix of the city's energy and quiet neglect. Pedestrians moved with their usual rhythm, some with purpose, others lost in thought, and some, like JD Vance, caught somewhere in between. Vance walked at a steady pace, hands in his jacket pockets. He dressed casually, blending into the city, but people still noticed him. Some stole glances, whispering. A few recognized him from TV, others from the headlines. His name carried weight, but at that moment, he was just another guy walking past aging storefronts, dodging abandoned scooters. Then a voice broke through the city noise. "Hey man, can you spare $1?" Vance had heard it before. Street requests were common. Usually it was a quick nod, a polite shake of the head, and life moved on. But something about this one, maybe the hesitation in the man's voice or the way he avoided eye contact, made Vance slow down. The man was thin, but not just from hunger. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes too big for his face. His mismatched layers spoke of survival, not style. His beard was patchy, his hands cracked from exposure. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't insistent, just waiting, like he'd asked 1,000 times before and expected nothing. Vance stopped. "What's your name?" The man blinked, thrown off. That wasn't how this usually went. He hesitated, then muttered, "Eddie." Vance studied him. Around them, people walked past, uninterested. To them, it was just another exchange between a politician and a man most ignored. But something about Eddie kept Vance there. Maybe it was the way his shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but exhaustion. Maybe it was his quiet dignity, just asking, not performing. "You live around here?" Vance asked. Eddie let out a humorless laugh. "I live wherever I can." Vance nodded but didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he asked, "How long have you been out here?" Eddie shifted, glancing toward the street like he was debating whether to keep talking or walk away. "Too long," he finally said. Vance exhaled. He could feel eyes on him now. Someone had stopped nearby, maybe listening, maybe recording. He didn't care. What he said next would matter. Eddie stuffed his hands into his oversized jacket, gripping nothing as if the motion itself kept them warm. Most politicians would have already walked away, or at best, handed over a few dollars before moving on. But Vance still didn't reach for his wallet. Eddie noticed. His expression flickered between expectation and disappointment, like he had already rehearsed this outcome. "I just need $1, he said again, softer this time, as if lowering the price might change the answer. Vance's response wasn't immediate. He glanced down the street. A small group of people had started watching. A man leaning against a light post, a woman slowing her pace, a teenager hovering nearby. The city had a way of turning private moments into public spectacle. Vance looked back at Eddie. "What would you do with it?" Eddie huffed, half laughing, half scoffing. "Ain't that the question?" But Vance wasn't joking. Eddie's expression hardened just a little. $1 don't get you much these days. Maybe a coffee, maybe a piece of bread if you know where to go." He paused, then quieter. "Or maybe just a moment where I don't feel like nothing." The words hung in the air. They weren't defensive, weren't begging, just true. Vance's jaw tightened. He glanced at Eddie's hands again, still stuffed in his pockets, fingers shifting as if trying to hold on to something invisible. "You used to work?" Vance asked. Eddie let out another bitter laugh. "Yeah, before life got in the way." Vance nodded slightly. "What was the job?" "Plumber. Residential mostly. Fixed leaks, replaced busted water heaters." He shook his head. "Ain't much demand for a guy without an address." Vance didn't argue. He had heard stories like this before. People slipping through the cracks so fast they barely had time to brace for impact. Eddie rubbed his chin. "So, you gonna give me $1 or what?" Another pause. Vance's answer wasn't what anyone expected. "I'll give you something better." Eddie frowned. "Man, I ain't asking for a sermon." "It's not a sermon," Vance said. Eddie eyed him warily. Conversations like this usually ended in a lecture. Bootstraps, responsibility, self-improvement. He braced himself for the same. But Vance didn't give a speech. He simply asked, "When's the last time someone gave you a real shot?" Eddie blinked, caught off guard. "What? Like a job?" "Like anything." Eddie looked past Vance, searching for an answer. Finally, he exhaled. "Been a while." Vance nodded. "You ever try to get off the streets?" Eddie scoffed. "What kind of question is that?" Vance didn't flinch. "You think I want to be out here?" Eddie continued. "Think this is a choice?" Vance stayed quiet. "I tried shelters," Eddie said. "Full before I even get in the door. Tried work. You know what they tell me? Come back when you got a phone. Come back when you got an address." Like I can pull that out of thin air. Vance crossed his arms. "You ever been homeless?" "No." Eddie smirked. "Yeah, didn't think so." "But I've been poor," Vance said. Eddie looked at him differently now, still skeptical but less dismissive. "Yeah?" Vance nodded. "Grew up in a house where the heat didn't always work, where the fridge was mostly empty. I know what it's like to go to school in the same clothes for 3 days straight." Eddie sniffed. "Yeah, well, bet you had a way out." Vance held his gaze. Took a while. A silence stretched between them. The small crowd had grown. Someone was recording. A woman whispered to her friend. "So what?" Eddie said. "You gonna tell me to pull myself up? Work harder?" Vance shook his head. "No." "Then what?" Vance reached into his jacket. Not for money, but for a small folded piece of paper. He held it out. Eddie eyed it suspiciously. "What's that?" "A name, a number." "For what?" "Someone who can help." Eddie scoffed. "Yeah, right." Vance didn't lower his hand. "It's real." Eddie hesitated. He had been handed false hope before. But something about Vance's face, the way he wasn't smiling, wasn't selling anything, made him pause. "Why are you doing this?" Eddie asked. Vance's answer was simple. "Because someone once did it for me." Eddie swallowed. His fingers twitched. He wasn't sure if this was real. He wasn't sure if he deserved it. "You gonna take it or not?" someone in the crowd muttered. Eddie hesitated, then reached out and took the paper. Maybe he'd make the call. Maybe he wouldn't. But for the first time in a long time, he had something more than just another empty promise. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't taking the help. It's believing you deserve it.